Okie doke. Let's talk about expanding the horizons, new religious groups in America. You know, there's one thing about religious freedom. We love it, appreciate it, we value it. But when you are free religiously, you can be free to develop new religions. And so America fostered a number of new religious ideas, and many of them are false. Many of them are cults, but many of them are quite popular. And so it's important for us to learn the origins of these movements. All right, let's look at some of their characteristics. There are factors causing the rise of new religious groups. Less traditionalism. All right, we're loosed from old traditions. We have religious freedom. We have freedom on the frontier. And of course, out in the frontier, separate from traditionalism, we have some new ideas that are developing. Now, revivalism, which we've just discussed, was a factor behind new religious groups. Revivalism was emotionally intense. All right, Nathan Hatch is a well-known American Christian historian. He says ecstasy is no guarantee of orthodoxy or that Christian fruit will result. All right, and so revivalism encouraged people to look beyond traditional churches for security. And also, there was the burnt over district in West New York, where Charles Finney repeatedly returned to bring his revival. And it was out of Western New York State that Mormonism developed. All right, people were seeking an immediate experience with God and new revelation. It's always dangerous when people believe that their revelation from God supersedes the scriptures and they advocate an immediate experience with God. This is always troublesome. The perfectionist lifestyle led to a list of do's and don'ts and an expectation that we can live perfectly. Therefore, those who don't live like we do are outsiders and to be rejected. Millennial expectations. Jesus is coming again. He's coming immediately. He's coming on this date. And those kinds of attitudes often lead to trouble. Most new religious groups exhibited one or all of these characteristics. All right, let's look and see just a selected group of new religious groups. Well, first we're going to look at the Unitarians, and honestly, they are one that doesn't feature the characteristics we looked at. Instead, they were a theological group that emphasized the unity or the oneness of God. They denied the Trinity. They denied the divinity of Christ. They were skeptical of the Second Great Awakening and the emotionalism that brought about. They also did not see a need for conversion because, frankly, they did not see in themselves sin or the need for redemption. The leaders included Charles Chauncey, Old Brick, Thomas Jefferson, the deist, and then W.E. Channing, who did more to organize the Unitarians into a denomination. Their beliefs included a denial of the Trinity, a denial of the deity of Christ. They denied the virgin birth, the vicarious atonement, that is, Jesus did not die for the sins of others. They denied the resurrection, that Jesus bodily returned from the dead. They certainly deny his second coming. All right, so they deny these fundamentals of the faith. Their belief statements are the fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of man, the leadership of Jesus, but not the lordship. Salvation by character. We are saved based on how we live. And they believe in the progress of humanity. So once again, we see this naive optimism about human nature. Unitarians typically were wealthy urbanites who rejected ideas of human sinfulness. By 1825, the Unitarians became a distinct denomination. All right, developing at much the same time were the Universalists. Their leadership came out of Harvard. They were, shall we say, lower socioeconomic Unitarians. They believe that everyone is saved or will be saved eventually, hence universal salvation. In 1961, Unitarians and Universalists merged into the Unitarian Universalist Association. Now let's talk about the Church of Christ. The background here is during the revivals, particularly the camp meetings, they perceived an interdenominational cooperation and a non-denominational nature. They were ecumenical in their focus. And so they denied denominations and wanted to create a Christian church, a church of Christ. They wanted to de-emphasize denominations, and as a result, they created a new denomination. In 1804, Barton Stone, remember he was the leader of the Cane Ridge camp meeting, other Presbyterians joined him to build on cooperation with the Methodists to create this non-denominational movement. These Stonites, as they were called, emphasized the need to restore primitive New Testament church. In fact, often this is referred to as a restoration movement. The tenets of the Church of Christ is anti-denominationalism, but they believe that they were the only true church. They teach baptismal regeneration. This means that within the Church of Christ, they teach that water baptism is necessary to complete salvation. This came home to me in a very unusual way back when I was in college at Texas Tech. I was on the BSU Executive Council, and it was my responsibility to organize Bible studies in each of the dorms. My friend Pat Graves was leading a Bible study at Carpenter Hall, and he called me one night and he said, "Rex, something strange happened tonight. The Bible study was infiltrated by a Church of Christ advocate, and all of a sudden, all the members of the Bible study were at the Church of Christ Student Union getting baptized." Oh my word. And so I learned a lot about Church of Christ through that experience. The Church of Christ also practices the Lord's Supper every Sunday. They are anti-missions. That doesn't mean that they are against foreign missions, but they are against missions agencies. And so every missionary must be sent out by an individual church rather than a denominational agency. They're biblicist. They will not practice anything that they do not see specifically in the Bible. For this reason, there's no instrumental music, no piano or organ. Now, as we saw with Ulrich Zwingli, we mentioned that there are instruments in the Old Testament, but not in the New Testament. And so, Church of Christ becomes excellent in their a cappella singing. But there are no doctrinal confessions either, because they do not see this in the Bible. Instead, it is the Bible alone that is their confession. They're very legalistic. It's almost a works salvation, and they teach falling from grace. So a very strict, rigid practice of do's and don'ts in the Church of Christ. Now in 1906, they split into two denominations. One denomination is the Disciples of Christ. They are the more liberal group, and the more conservative group is the Church of Christ. Well, let's talk briefly about varieties of Baptists. This typically is a topic for Baptist heritage, but there are anti-missions Baptists. After the formation of the Triennial Convention, which was the convention of missionary work for the Baptists, some Baptists opposed organizing beyond the local church or association for missions, and so they rejected the Triennial Convention and traditional American Baptists. These anti-missions groups include primitive Baptists, who are hyper-Calvinists. That is, they believe that one would insult the sovereignty of God to offer an invitation to those who are non-elect. They also would not deem it appropriate to actually travel as a missionary to other parts of the world. Also, New General Baptists, some Free Will Baptists are opposed to missions agencies. Then there are the landmarkists. When the Church of Christ drew away many Baptists, landmarkism was the Baptist reaction. Landmarkists taught that the Baptist Church originated when John the Baptist baptized Jesus in the Jordan River. This is known as the JJJ theory. And they teach that Baptist succession can be traced throughout church history. Here's what I mean. J.M. Carroll composed the Trail of Blood. J.M. Carroll was the brother of B.H. Carroll, the founder of Southwestern Baptist Seminary. And he looked through history and could see Baptistic faith traditions throughout the centuries of the church, all the way back to the very beginning. Everywhere you see a red dot, this is the Trail of Blood. But in order to see a connection, he had to claim Baptist faith for a number of very unusual movements, such as the Montanists or the Donatists. The Donatists were an extreme group that claimed that the established Catholic Church was false, and the true church then was the Donatist Church, and their members had to be rebaptized into their church. All right, so for J.M. Carroll, this was an obvious Baptist move to reject Roman Catholic infant baptism and to require adult believers' baptism. The fallacy here is that for Donatist families, their infants were baptized as infants in the Donatist church, so they're not Baptistic at all. Notice that the Albigensians are included in this Trail of Blood, but the Albigensians, well, yes, they required rebaptism in order to be admitted into their tradition, but they were adoptionist in their theology. That is, they believed that Jesus was human, not divine. And so you can see the fallacy of the Trail of Blood. And in reaction against landmarkism, Baptist scholars began to teach what I have already taught you, that Baptists came out of the English separatist movement in the 17th century. All right, let's talk about the Millerites. I mentioned them in our last lecture. William Miller was originally a Baptist, then he became a deist, and he converted to the Baptist faith again and began to study the Bible in order to defend the Christian faith against his deist friends. Well, as he studied the scripture, he came upon a verse in Daniel, Daniel 8:14. Daniel 8:14 reads, "He said to me," that is the Holy One speaking to Daniel, said, "For 2300 evenings and mornings, then the holy place will be properly restored." All right, William Miller, in his exegesis of this verse, decided that 2300 years from Artaxerxes' decree to rebuild Jerusalem, which took place in 457 BC, then to the second coming was 2300 years. He calculated this as a time between March 21, 1843 and March 21, 1844. So during this year, Christ was going to come back. Well, obviously that did not happen, and so he revised his date to October 22, 1844. He was so convincing that thousands of followers sold their possessions and left their employment to wait for Christ's return. The failure of Miller's prophecies discredited him and his movement. This was called the Great Disappointment. And so it discredited not only William Miller and not only his movement, but it brought disrepute upon Christianity as a whole. You can see from this newspaper ad that Miller used media to promote his biblical prophecy. Horace Greeley's New York Tribune ran this ad on March 2nd, 1843, the day before the original predicted return of Christ. Well, more recently, in 2011, Harold Camping was promoting Judgment Day on May 21st of 2011. He put this date on billboards, on the sides of buses. It was an internet sensation. He raised a lot of money, but of course, May 21, 2011 came and went, and we still are waiting for Christ's return. So I tell my students this: if you ever hear a preacher name a date for Christ's return, turn and run. Do not listen to another word that person says, because he or she has already been proved to be a false prophet. Well, speaking of false prophet, let's talk about the Seventh-day Adventists and Ellen Gould White. She was a Methodist from Maine with only a third grade education, but she joined Miller's movement in the 1840s, and when Miller failed, she picked up the movement and ran with it. She claimed that the advent that Miller predicted was prevented by a failure to observe the Sabbath, and so she founded the Seventh-day Adventists, saying that if we observe the seventh day as the day of worship, if we follow the commands of the Old Testament, then we will create a movement that will prepare the way for Christ's return. Well, her movement was joined by Seventh-day Baptists who already were worshiping on the seventh day, and so they fit right in with this new Seventh-day group. They worship on the Sabbath. They follow a strict dietary code according to the Old Testament. They accept the gift of prophecy, especially White's teachings. They believe in free will, believers' baptism by immersion. They observe communion 4 times a year. They avoid worldly entertainment and consider themselves to be the true remnant. They also teach soul sleep and annihilation. So their eschatology is unique, shall we say. When a person dies, he or she goes to sleep and waits there for Christ's return, at which time they're revived. But just like sleep seems like time passes quickly, those whose souls are asleep also do not observe the passing of time, but Christ's return then feels instantaneous to them when they awaken. Also, annihilation is the teaching that when an unbeliever dies and suffers damnation, that pain is temporary until that person's soul is annihilated to exist no more. So these are two unusual but not totally unheard of expressions of eschatology. The Seventh-day Adventists operate private schools, universities, and hospitals. When I worked for Cargill Associates, a firm of fundraising consultants, we consulted with a number of Seventh-day Adventist institutions. All right, let's move on to talk about the Mormons. They are probably the best known and widest spread of these new religions that we are discussing. The founder was Joseph Smith Jr. He grew up poor in western New York. His father saw visions. His father was a treasure hunter, often arrested for digging in his neighbor's property looking for treasure. In 1820, Joseph Jr. saw a vision of his own. In this vision, an angel named Moroni revealed that divine scripture was buried nearby. 7 years later, Moroni appeared again to reveal the location of golden tablets and translating spectacles. These spectacles were required to enable Smith to translate from a language he called Reformed Egyptian. And the result is the Book of Mormon. In the Book of Mormon, there is a story. There are two tribes who descended from the lost tribes of Israel. These tribes were never heard from after the Assyrian conquest, but they immigrated to America. There are the Lamanites and the Nephites. The Lamanites are the Native Americans, and they apostatized. And they defeated the Nephites, killing all of them except Mormon and his son Moroni. Mormon buried scripture at Cumorah Hill, and then Moroni revealed this secret hiding place to Joseph Smith. So in 1830, Joseph Smith began the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints with 5 of his friends. Of those 5, one of them was Sidney Rigdon, who eventually left the Mormon cause and accused the others of fraud. From 1831 to 1840, the Mormons settled in Ohio and then Missouri. They grew to a few thousand followers who believed Joseph Smith. And then during the next 6 years, they founded Nauvoo, Illinois, where they created their own laws under Smith's militaristic leadership and began the practice of polygamy. It seems that Joseph Smith got caught with the wife of another one of his founding friends, that is Pratt, and when he got caught with his friend's wife, he said that it was revealed to him that polygamy was a part of this new religion, and so the Mormons practiced polygamy until the United States banned it. Well, Smith and his brother Hiram ultimately were arrested. Their followers smuggled some pistols into the jail, and when they tried to shoot their way out, both of them were killed in a skirmish. As a result, their deaths were considered martyrdoms and made Mormons more committed to their cause. After the death of Joseph Smith, Brigham Young became the leader of the Mormons. He had joined the Mormons in 1832, and in 1846 he led the Mormons to Great Salt Lake, Utah, calling it Zion of the Wilderness. Now, Brigham Young was reputed to be quite authoritarian, militaristic, and even brutal. After his settlement in Great Salt Lake, there were a group of settlers on their way through Utah heading toward California. And in fear of outsiders, Brigham Young ordered the massacre of 120 of these settlers at Mount Meadows. In 1850, Young became the governor of the Utah Territory, and by 1870 the Mormons exceeded 140,000 members. Now let's talk about Mormon theology just briefly. They teach the doctrine of eternal progression. As man is, God once was. As God is, man may become. And so spiritual progress is based on human choices, and they have a very complex doctrine of the afterlife by which a person goes from planet to planet, assuming a divinity based on one's choices on earth. They are polytheistic, that is, they teach that there are many gods. According to Mormons, Adam was seen as God of this earth, and a true Mormon can become a god of another planet. Polygamy and marriage is taught both for time and for eternity. There are elaborate temple ceremonies that resemble Masonic ceremonies, because Joseph Smith and the other 5 founders of Mormonism all were master masons, and so they incorporated these Masonic symbols in the Mormon tabernacle. They practice baptism for the dead, because according to their doctrine, it's possible for someone who has died to become a Mormon, but one of their descendants must be baptized on their behalf. For this reason, ancestry is very important to Mormons, and they have developed Ancestry.com. Yes, that very well-known internet site is a product of Mormon doctrine. Of the groups we have discussed today, Mormonism is the only one that competes with Christianity today, and they are a very prominent cult in America and around the world. If you want to learn more about Mormonism, I recommend The Kingdom of the Cults, written by Walter Martin. It discusses Mormonism at length, along with Jehovah's Witnesses and other cults. Another resource for you is the Watchman organization. I should say Watchman Fellowship. Their website is watchman.org, headed by James Walker, who comes out of Mormonism and has become one of the leading apologists in opposition to Mormonism and other cults, and is a defender of true Christianity. He often has been on the NOBTS campus speaking at our Defend conference every year. And so again, watchman.org is another great resource if you want to learn more about Mormonism and other cults. Well, thank you very much for your attention. Let's continue to move on in our discussion of American Christianity. Actually, we're going to be looking at global Christianity and the expansion of Christianity through the work of missions.